Hello, good evening, morning, wherever y'all are. My name is Joe Fizz, and we're going to get started with the first third shift thoughts in over 2 months. And I apologize because this is something that I have been wanting to do for a long time coming. However, there have been finals, life events, more things have happened. So I wanted to express my deepest sorrows in regards to that, and we're gonna get kicked right in to third shift thoughts. DV, do you have anything?
So I think that the coolest thing about this is that my voice changed in the time that we were gone. So here it is. Third shift thoughts with Joe Fizz.
Okay, I think I miss the older DV voice. So while I try to figure out that, here's the intro. All right, y'all. So today I'm going to bring in a couple different topics that are near and dear to my heart. The first is going to be Dungeons and Dragons, and the second is going to be podcasting, with obviously the musical interlude in between. All right, so to get started, the one that I am the most excited about, we are going to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. So, what is Dungeons and Dragons? Where does it come from? Why is this now a resurging popularity? So, we get to think about it this way. We got to go back to the late 70s, early 80s, when Gary Gygax created a tabletop role playing game, or a TTRPG, that was centered around an adventuring party, or maybe even just one person, and they go out into a fictitious world known as Greyhawk, and they partake in quests, battles. Think, if you will, Geoffrey Chaucer's um, adventures and stories. I forget what they're called now, which is terrible because my English teacher from high school would annihilate me. But basically, think of that. It's the Canterbury Tales. Sorry, shout out to T. Scraz. I did not forget that. So basically, take the Canterbury Tales, give them mythical creatures such as beholders, illithids, which are mind flayers. We'll get into the mind flayer part in a little bit, and other various types of creatures, mythical creatures, ones that Gygax himself made up, and you put them in this fantasy setting and have a high fantasy type game. Now, over the years, there have been different offshoots of it. There have been many more editions, but we saw the huge spike in popularity grow with the introduction of Stranger Things. As we remember from season one in the opener, you see the main characters sitting around a table and they are playing Dungeons and Dragons. Now, call it what you will, call it Stranger Things cultural phenomenon, call it nostalgia factor, call it just other various things. But essentially, Dungeons and Dragons came back. It created its fifth edition. I think it was in 2014, if I recall correctly. But anyway, it saw this huge spike in popularity. Now we have to consider a couple other factors too with our later topic, the podcasting. For people who, liked Stranger Things or just like Dungeons and Dragons from when they were a kid, but don't have necessarily an outlet for it or don't like Stranger Things, what happened with Dungeons and Dragons is now there are a lot of podcasts out there, unlike this one, that have many more people who sit around a table and they play Dungeons and Dragons. So, for example, the big one that if you're in the community, will stand out is Critical Role. Critical Role is Matthew Mercer and a bunch of his friends and his wife, and they sit around the table each week on Thursday nights and play Dungeons and Dragons. I can't understate how great this is because there's a huge community behind it. They've raised a lot of money via Kickstarter to be able to produce a series run by themselves on Amazon Prime. That's in for 2 seasons right now, all because they decided to take a chance and stream on Twitch and make this a thing. I mean, they grew under the Geek and Sundry banner, and then they had a split from them, and now their own independent company. But the thing about Dungeons and Dragons is, and why there's another reason why this is a cultural success right now, is because in a highly digital age, this forces people to sit around the table or get together once a week via the internet too, and there's interactions. So, for example, sites such as Roll20 and others bring you together on the digital format using your webcam and a like its own module essentially, and you can put in not Stranger Things. You can put in Dungeons and Dragons as the game setting, and you can run Dungeons and Dragons online. The more traditional way is to get a group of people from around your community and you sit together at the table once a week. Now, how does the game work? It seems like there are a lot of components, but how does it actually work? You essentially have these 3 core rule books, and at least in 5th edition, and they consist of the Player's Handbook, which is everything you need to know if you just want to play, the Dungeon Master's Handbook, which is the game master who oversees the game and is essentially like a rules, not necessarily a lawyer, but essentially helps practition the story along. So they have, character voices and maps and a story that they can either read from a pre-generated book. So, for example, the Stranger Things set has a pre-generated story in it, and you just read from that. Or they do what's called a homebrew campaign, where you make it up as you go, which I have done both. They both have their perks. I know the pre-generated modules are really easy and fun because they have a certain story that you can follow and allows for some deviation from that story, relatively minimal in others. Or you can do a homebrew game where you can implement new characters, new settings, new stories, build the map as you grow, other various instances. So the bottom line, what you need to know is that the game is centered around different sided dice, different sided polyhedral dice that determine the fate of the characters. So for example, I have with me a D20. It can't talk, obviously, because it's a dice. But it has 20 different sides, and I'm going to roll. So I got an 8. Typically, the Dungeon Master is the one who rules how successful or not it is. The Dungeon Master can even fudge the rules sometimes. Hopefully not all the time, because that wouldn't be too much fun. But the Dungeon Master can essentially determine how the outcome goes. So for example, they will sit there and they will say, because I rolled an 8, if I was the Dungeon Master, and it depends on what they were trying to do, and also the modifiers that they have on their character sheet, which I will also explain in a little bit. If I rolled an 8, just a straight 8, nothing modifying it at all, as a Dungeon Master, I would say, you go and you attempt to do this, but it doesn't work. Unless the DC or the difficulty class was extremely, extremely low. I know sometimes people can get off on certain tasks on like a 10, sometimes even an 8. Really just depends on what it is you're trying to do. To get into the fantasy aspect of it and how it plays a part, we have to look at the character sheet. Now, taking the time to build a character, it does take time. It's going to take you a minute, especially if you're new. And that's another perk of sometimes of the pre-generated modules like Stranger Things. They have character sheets built in them. So you can just pull them out of the box and you can go. You can start to play, obviously, after you read a little bit of the rules so you understand how it works. But, for example, say I was playing I have this character sheet up right now. Say I was playing a level 3 cleric, a wood elf that is lawful good. So I'm a cleric, or rather a healer, someone who isn't on a sworn path like a paladin is, but essentially honors a deity and what it does. I'm a wood elf, which is a subrace of the general elven population, which brings its own perks. And I'm lawful good, which means I typically try to be on the more good side and abide by the law. So, for example, on the character sheet, it has a list of skill sets. And let's say I wanted to go and ride a horse. My animal handling modifier is a +2, so I add that to whatever is on my 20-sided dice. So I got a 7 plus 2 is a 9. So again, it's one of those interesting kind of, I don't want to say a mixed success, but depending on how the Dungeon Master sees fit, I may not be able to ride my horse. So it is what it is. I'm trying to think of anything else that you really, really need to know. There's spells and magic, other various things that you can add to this. I'm actually going to do something a little bit different. Instead of the music interlude, this time I'm going to do kind of a mini rundown of Dungeons & Dragons. I'm going to do a different character voices and things like that and bring it to you here on the podcast. In the last couple of minutes that I have to talk about Dungeons & Dragons, you may know about a fair bit of stigma that surrounds the game. The first being that it's like a evil spirit summoning thing, and I want to debunk this right now. I have been in several Dungeons & Dragons groups. I run 2 Dungeons & Dragons groups as the Dungeon Master. I've never once incorporated anything that was remotely malicious into this. It's not really a cult. I say not really because I know there are some people who would likely take it to the extreme. However, this is not a cult. This is a community, and it's a very healthy community to be in. It's a very accepting community. Whatever it is that your character is, the Dungeon Master typically works with that and brings kind of like a fruition into it. So you yourself, as the playable character, feel really good. Trying to think of anything else. There is a bit of role-playing aspect to it, as you'll see in the quote-unquote music interlude. There is a lot of interesting components to Dungeons & Dragons that is kind of hard to condense on a 30 to 40 minute podcast, but it is something that I absolutely love, and I hope that y'all enjoy it too. Let's see, anything else that I can surmise about Dungeons & Dragons? If you have a new player, they produce starter sets, which has a mini module in it that you can run. How many people it takes to play? It typically, you could do 2 players. I've seen a video where Stephen Colbert and Matt Mercer are playing Dungeons & Dragons for Red Nose Day. So Mercer is the DM and Colbert is obviously the playable character. Mercer does all the different non-playable characters, so their voices and their actions, and Stephen Colbert does his playable character parts. I personally think that this game is absolutely fantastic. If you want to listen to podcasts and stuff, I can introduce those to you as well. There is a podcast that I personally love called The Adventure Zone. So that one is the McElroy brothers and their dad, and they play Dungeons & Dragons. So this one's really good for a new player. There is some explicit language because, you know, they're adults. And basically, the reason why I like it is that Clint, which is their dad, is learning too. So as they're playing, they're learning the game. Another good one, obviously, is Critical Role. Critical Role, though, is pretty dense. It's a good one because it has a lot of different voice actors and stuff, but it can be overwhelming for new players. It certainly was for me. And then the final one that I would recommend is Dungeons and Daddies, but that's not like what it sounds like. It's not a BDSM podcast, which is what they say in their tagline. That one specifically is centered around these like quote unquote real world dads, and they end up going to the Forgotten Realms, which is a player setting in Dungeons and Dragons. So these are some pretty good podcasts to start you off. There are other various ones. If you hear Pathfinder, it is a variation of Dungeons and Dragons 3.5. This is going to be controversial, but I think that for a new player, give them 5th edition because it is more streamlined. It'll make more sense in the long run. You can always pick up Pathfinder later. I personally don't like Pathfinder because I feel like it's kind of clunky, not necessarily streamlined, and there's a lot more extra math. Whereas I was reading the word Stranger Things, but I was looking at Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons is more centered around the, not as much math, streamlining it, making it more sense, and then ultimately giving the player a lot less confusing math to deal. So we're going to dive in 1 second, and I'm going to introduce a new character to the show. So here we go. Hey there, Thompson. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Yeah. How about yourself?
Not so bad, man. I'm just hanging in there. I heard you wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons.
Hey, I've always wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons. I've always wanted to try. I've never really thought about how I was going to do it, but I think that it'd be great for me to do.
Yeah, it'd be something that would be a lot of fun. I actually have a player sheet for you. So here we go. And let's see what we got.
Okay.
So you find yourself in a small town.
Mm-hmm.
It is pretty beat up and run down. There are things about it that really cause you to take note. The first thing is that there is a small tavern with bustling crowd coming in and out of it. The second is the smithy. There is a blacksmith shop around the corner.
Okay.
You can hear the pangs as the metal hits the anvil and the ruddy smell of metal being pressed. In addition, in the other corner, you see a library, which is really interesting for a small town, but this library seems to be really well built up. It's something that takes your attention and you focus in on it, and you see a few people coming in and out here and there, but there's a weird insignia above the door.
Oh, that's not
And then
good.
there are roads leading out of town, east to west. And yeah, so what do you want to do?
I would really like to make a perception check on that weird insignia to see if I can gain anything from it.
Yeah, a perception check would be really great right here. So go ahead and roll a d20 and add your perception skill modifier.
So that's a +4 to the D20 roll. I got a 4. A 4 plus 4 is an 8.
Okay, so you can't really garnish anything from this distance.
Damn.
There just seems to be a weird insignia. There's not really much insight you can gain from that perception check.
Okay, so I'm going to go up to the library and I'm going to look in. Oh, what the hell? I'm going to go into the library and see if I can see anything from inside and see if there are any weird types, anything where I can see that insignia on the inside.
Sure. So you walk into the door, and the first thing that you take in is that for this being a really rundown town with houses scattered around that look really, really impoverished, You see that in the library proper, that there is a lot of money funneled into here. There are books that are at least 2 times higher than you stand tall. A lot of very well-dressed patrons moving in and out. Actually, you hear from, as soon as you walk in, a voice go, "I'm sorry, can I help you?"
Yes, I would like to... The hell with it. I would like to know what that insignia is above the door, and I'm going to roll a persuasion check.
Absolutely. So
Sweet.
roll a d20 and add your charisma modifier.
I think this dice is loaded. I got a 9 plus 0, which is a 9.
Excellent. Surprisingly, even with that roll, she looks to you and she says,
Yes.
That insignia is for the Crimson Reserve. The Crimson Reserve are the essentially scholars of this land. I'm terribly sorry, and your name was?
My name is Desmond. My name is Desmond Foddery, and I'm here to inquire upon specifically why... I don't know. I'm new to this town. Is there anything that you could let me in on or tell me? I'm basically going to roll another persuasion check.
Sure. So go ahead and roll once again a d20 and add that persuasion or the charisma modifier.
Hey, here we go. I got an 11. An 11 plus 0 is an 11.
Yeah, so even in that little interim of time, she probably just wants you to get off her back. So she goes, personally, I'm not really too sure. It's quite a not very bustling town. I see you are either some kind of paladin or a cleric.
Yes.
Yes. So there are certain selections for paladins and clerics. If you would like to follow me, please. And she basically hops down from her stool. She is actually a halfling.
Oh.
So she hops down and she walks over to the certain section.
Okay, great. Do I see anything within the shelves that would particularly stand out to me?
Yeah, I think... Well, go ahead and... I'm going to say make an investigation check. Let's see if you can get something higher than a 11.
I got a 19 plus 1, which is a... They call it a dirty 20, right?
Yeah, so basically, whenever you roll a d20, anything that you add to it, they call it dirty.
Okay.
Natural is anything otherwise. A natural 20 is a critical success. A natural 1 is a critical failure.
Oh, fantastic.
So, with a dirty 20, you definitely see something that stands out. Your deity is Pelor, right?
Yeah.
So, with Pelor, there is a book that stands out, and it says Hidden Spells of Pelor. You can tell that actually this is a very, very rare book. Really weird that she has it sitting in there.
Okay, so from there, I'm going to look at her and I'm going to say, this is a pretty rare book. Why by chance do you have it just sitting in here like that?
I have it by chance sitting out.
Shouldn't just be lying about. Somebody could take it or whatnot.
Yes. The reason why I have it sitting out is because I wanted to give it to somebody like you in the event that it came along. Then nobody's really using it. Yeah, so I wanted to give it to you.
That's interesting.
This is something that she, recognizes. She seems pretty emphatic about it.
Okay, yeah. So I take the book and I hold it and I start to look through it to see if I can see anything else interesting about it.
Okay.
But first I look up at her and I say, thank you for this. I greatly appreciate it.
She looks at you and she says, "No problem. I hope you enjoy your stay here at the Crimson Archive and in the town. And yes, have a good rest of your day."
I turn and look back to her and I say, thank you. And I start to dive through the book.
All right. And that's where we're going to call the session for today. So as you can see, thank you, Thompson. So as you can see, Dungeons and Dragons is one of those things that sitting around a table or on your the platform that you use to play, sitting around the table, having people, getting into the story, having different characters, having different character voices, really builds this world that is truly addicting. Rolling the D20, seeing what happens next based on the roll. And when I say addicting, it's just a lot of fun. So that's Dungeons and Dragons. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to me through my email at josrbYers@gmail.com. So next, we're going to dive into the world of podcasting. So podcasting, what is it? What is the nature of it? So basically, in the mid to early 2000s, podcasting started to become a pretty big thing. I know when I was in elementary school, they were talking about it, and I really had no idea what it was. But then once I got into middle school, I was introduced to this podcast called Welcome to Night Vale. It's essentially this really bizarro, kind of creepy, fictitious town. Think of Stephen King's Desperation, but just put into a town, kind of Lovecraftian too. But essentially it follows this narrator named Cecil Baldwin. He's a radio show host. And he just details about what's going on in the town every 2 weeks. As I mentioned earlier with Dungeons and Dragons, Critical Role is another big one. They play every Thursday and they turn it into a podcast. Same with the McElroy family. They have the Adventure Zone, which is a really good one to get started on Dungeons and Dragons. It runs about an hour per episode. And they also have My Brother and Me, Sawbones, Schmanners. They have a bunch of other podcasts within their network that they disseminate to everybody. So My Brother and Me is basically the three brothers, Justin, Travis, and Justin, Travis, and Griffin, and they all sit down and they talk just about random stuff. I remember the one time I tuned in, they were talking about Garfield and this Garfield restaurant that was opening up. But anyway, podcasts typically have a theme, whether it's weekly or just for the overall show, and they just dive right into it. I know this one, kudos, you've already started listening to one. This one is particularly about third shift thoughts. So whatever comes to my mind on third shift, I think about it, write it down, and then the next day I show up and put it out there. So, podcasting is usually spread via RSS feed, which basically is like a subscription feed, or you can get it through, your favorite places like Apple Music, Spotify, Google Play, YouTube, various of those kind of instances. It basically pops up into your feed each time an episode is posted. The way I think of podcasts, I think of back in the day when radio was starting to become a big thing and they had radio shows. Basically, podcasts are radio shows mass disseminated throughout the internet and that you can cater to you. Most of these podcasts now are becoming live shows, which you're thinking, okay, do they sit behind a desk and they, put out whatever? No, actually. What they do is for things like Night Vale, who have different voice actors that come in, they will have their own unique story for that specific live show, or they'll have a tour of that specific live show, kind of like a mini play, and they go up there with microphones and they do it. They'll have a musical guest. They'll bring updates about the show, things like that. My Brother and Me, and the Adventure Zone, they'll either play Dungeons and Dragons or do a My Brother and Me. I forgot to mention that it's like a help service, so they answer like a bunch of Yahoo Answers questions, and they'll respond to them in real time. They'll have a show like that. Critical Role does live ones. The other one that I know that's really good is Last Podcast on the Left. They have a live show where they basically talk about things that they found and audience questions and things like that. So I would actually love to do a Third Shift Thoughts one, but I don't know who would come and listen to it and if somebody would actually give me the space to be able to do that. So, yeah, I can't really imagine a promoter being like, yeah, we're going to promote this dude talking about what he thinks about on Third Shift, but you never know. So, but anyway, podcasting is pretty fun to do. It usually takes me about like a half hour of my time to actually produce and create, which is really awesome because I'm a pretty busy individual. So that's pretty nice. And then beyond that, the editing and stuff really just comes down to GarageBand and a little background information that I have about splicing audio sound, which basically means, say if I mess up, I just section out that portion of the podcast and cut it out. And then I will update it, changing over it or whatever. So yeah, I personally love podcasting. I can't promote it enough. It's kind of cathartic for me just to like talk and then receive feedback from people. Some feedback that I've received about this one in particular is that people actually really like it, which is really cool because that not only kind of wants me to keep doing it, but also makes me feel pretty proud that I'm producing something that people really like. Other than that, you just need a microphone and then a audio interface. So I use a Behringer audio face. It's one of the smaller ones, but I can plug a guitar into it and I can adjust my audio as I go. And I personally love it. So if y'all want to get into podcasting, again, hit me up. I can give you some sources. I know a good one that we disseminate this podcast through is called Pinecast.com. It's $5 a month for me to produce as many episodes as I want. And I personally love it because it's pretty hands-free, and the interaction I've had with the people who run it, they've responded to my questions really easily, and yeah, I think it's pretty good. Other ones are Castbox. I know Apple does their own too, but I don't know how to get into that. So I think with that, I don't really have too much more to say about podcasting. In general, it's just a lot of fun, and it's great to use as a conversation piece. And yeah, that's really about it. I know I didn't have too much DV in here. I apologize. For some reason, the sound that I used for him, like the voice modulator, wasn't really working well today. I really don't want to keep him on robot voice, but we'll see what ends up happening. And with that, dear friends, I'm pretty much done with this episode. I just wanted to say I hope your holidays are merry and bright in the upcoming weeks. And one final closing thought with the last few minutes that I'm going to do this. Please be incredibly kind. Be incredibly kind to somebody today. Just better humanity. Pay it forward is what I've always been told. Put some time and effort into somebody else, whether it's just complimenting them on their outfit, not creepily, or, just saying that they have a really nice smile. Just something to give them something to get through the day. The holiday season is really rough, as we all know, for various reasons. And I just want to put that out there. Just please, please, please. Even if that's all you can afford this season, just afford the time, the split second it takes to compliment somebody and just show incredibly hopeful kindness. Again, I know that some people aren't as outgoing. Maybe it's paying for someone's drink at Starbucks, paying for the person behind you. They don't have to know, they don't have to overtly know, but you're paying it forward. You're doing something to better the cause of humanity, even however small it is. And with that, I think that is going to be the episode for today. I'm going to try, as I say all the time, to keep more to the 2-week schedule, especially with being on a holiday break. However, life and events happen, so I will try my best to do that. Also, I have exciting news for those who would like something a little more different than this podcast. If you're interested in what's called serial podcasts, which is basically where one builds off the other, I have another podcast called Graymore. I'm actually turning it into a book. While I'm on this break, I'm actually writing a few more chapters of said book, but it's basically about a security guard finding mysterious and mystical creatures and events that happen in a fictitious college campus in the Northeast United States. So if you really enjoy that kind of vibe, kind of creepy vibe, Stephen King-esque, or Lovecraftian, or Night Vale, if you're familiar with Welcome to Night Vale, try out the podcast. And as always, please like, share, comment this podcast. Share it with your friends, family, enemies, strangers, whatever the case may be. It means a lot to me. It means a lot to have that kind of feedback. And yeah, so until next time, y'all, have a good, safe adventure. We'll see you next time.